Welcome to my presentation on the learning model analysis. First of all, I'm going to use my initial learning model and make some connections to theories. And then I will introduce a revised version of the model and also provide some connections to theories and mention the theories that have informed my learning model. So this is the initial one, and I'll go over each of the components that I considered initially. So first of all, I considered the meaning of learning, who the learner is, the learning environment, and the role of the educator. From my initial understanding, learning was an ongoing process and individual changes and societal changes would happen as a result. Learning happened in both formal and informal contexts, and a part of learning is individual, happening inside one's person's brain. At the same time, it happens with the help of a teacher and peers. Yet, the emphasis is on the individual possession or acquisition of knowledge inside one's brain. Evidence of learning, from my original perspective, was seen everywhere, and mechanisms of learning were brain and social constructs. I saw the learner as someone in the center of learning or a learning circle, and I also considered identity as a possession. So I saw identity as a combination of cultural and linguistic background, prior knowledge and experiences, social networks, motivation, and emotions. I want to emphasize that again, initially I considered this concept to be fixed and something that a learner possesses. For the learning environment, I mentioned both formal and informal contexts and co-construction of knowledge, as well as individual acquisition and transfer of knowledge. And I saw the main role of an educator as a facilitator, which was inspired by Vygotsky's theories of zone of proximal development. And now I would like to go ahead and make some more connections with theories of the concepts of the components that I have just presented. So even though I see learning as an ongoing process here, it is still seen as something that an individual possesses and something that happens inside each person's brain. This is definitely an example of acquisition metaphor in general and cognitive theories of learning. However, a couple of times I mentioned society-related aspects, such as societal changes happen as a result of learning, or social constructs or mechanisms of learning. This does illustrate Vygotsky's framework with the interdependence of social and individual processes in the co-construction of knowledge, and also a sociocultural perspective, the one, for example, that is generalized by Lee et al. Proposition 2, the primacy of learning from, with, and through others. So I do emphasize that learning happens with the help of a teacher as a facilitator and peers. However, overall, the emphasis is definitely on the acquisition of knowledge and the cognitive aspects of learning. In the model, I indicate both formal and informal contexts, and I do not elaborate on this in the model's description, but according to Bransford et al. Work, one sense of context is making comparisons across activities, forms of participation, and types of interaction in various settings. Such definition definitely emphasizes participatory structures and practices in different communities. The final connection that I'd like to make here is the consideration of identity as a characteristic of a learner. And now I think that such interpretation makes this concept fixed. And I used to think of identity as a possession and a fixed construct. Now I would like to introduce my revised learning model, and I decided to give it some sort of a name inspired by, I would say, mostly Sfard's article. So the name for my learning model is Purposeful Eclectism Model of Learning, guided by the dyad of acquisition and participation metaphors. I do still have some components that I used to have in my previous model, and some of my thoughts are similar. However, there has been a significant change and definitely an influence of a sociocultural theory on a way I see learning now. Let's take a look at it together. So, the main components. First of all, I considered knowledge and what it is for me. So we can definitely see here a plurality of metaphors of acquisition and participation one. And for acquisition specifically, I think it relates to the rationalism theory. So I see knowledge as something that is constructed by the mind, so it's a possession, but it is not solely possessed by an individual or an expert. It is also an aspect of practice or participation in an activity. And this is directly related then to the process of learning, where I try to give some numbers like 30% for acquisition of something and becoming a more central participant in a community of practice, which has 70%. And of course, these numbers are just tentative and a lot depends on the context, on the specific situation, on a learner. But with these numbers, I just wanted to emphasize that now I tend to lean more towards learning as participation. And yet, I still approach it from the plurality of metaphors position. Here, I also consider individual learning trajectories and group learning trajectories inspired by Green and Grisalfi's situated learning theory, and learning as participation with interpersonal and informational aspects of an activity. So for interpersonal aspects, I do think about the importance of group or individual work and communication between the participants. While for the informational aspects, I consider the mastery of concepts and the importance of moving from peripheral participation to more central participation. Let's move on and talk a bit more about the learner. I think this definition is also inspired by the situated learning theory. So participants with an individual and group learning trajectories which change as a result of learning. I also consider the importance of opportunities to learn and opportunities to exercise conceptual agency for successful learning. And the role of the educator in the process of learning is being a more experienced participant who has his or her own learning trajectories too, as well as the group learning trajectories. And more importantly, an educator is also open to ongoing learning. So his or her learning is not stable, but rather changes with the influence of group learning trajectories. And finally, I do consider the identity and positioning point. And on the right, I have selected some of the adjectives that really stood out to me from Carlon's et al. Work. And these adjectives are engaged, curious, empathetic, and collaborative learning practices and learners. And from Nasser et al. Work, I really like the idea of sense of belonging. So this is related to the opportunities to learn and learning pathways and when students feel a sense of belonging and how it affects their identity formation and how it affects their learning as a result. And this is something that, for example, I want to see in formal contexts if I teach in a classroom. And for me, sense of belonging and empathy are really important characteristics. So for identity and positioning, I do consider celebrated subject positions that enable students' identity work as learners who are moving from novice learners to more central participation. And this is done through equitable learning pathways. I feel like this phrase is a combination of multiple theories within the sociocultural theory. So I do consider celebrated subject positions that are encouraged in the classroom. And I mentioned that I want my students, for example, to be engaged and curious and possess a certain degree of conceptual agency or have opportunities to exercise this conceptual agency. Then we have the situated learning and the learners who move from peripheral participation to more central one. And finally, we have Nasser's et al. Work that emphasizes equitable learning pathways for all the learners. And this is something that is important for me in my learning model. Thank you much for listening to my presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions or read or listen to some comments. And I really enjoyed doing this analysis and making connections to theories for my first learning model. And it was interesting to see how certain parts of the learning model have still persisted, but I think I developed a more comprehensive understanding of the concept of participation and how it influences learning and how participation can actually be learning in itself. So I enjoyed the process of creating this presentation, and thank you for your time and attention.